Russian President Vladimir Putin finds himself on the ropes on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine. Kyiv has developed an overwhelming short-term advantage in drone warfare, sowing chaos across Russian backlands and severing the land bridge between Crimea and the Russian border. On the home front, Ukrainian long-range drones are hitting Russian refineries, factories, and even well-defended cities at such unprecedented rates that the Kremlin is now encouraging Russian banks and businesses to buy their own private air defenses. New and deadly weapons are swelling the Ukrainian arsenal, from Swedish Gripen fighter jets to American-made Hornet drones, as €90 billion are about to hit Ukrainian coffers. In a recent interview with Reuters, the commander of Ukraine's 3rd Army Corps and founder of the elite Azov battalion laid out his nation's case, stating, "I believe the next 6 to 9 months are a turning point. More precisely, I think the next 6 are the most critical." But as we've said before here on Power Doctrine, and we'll emphasize it again, when Vladimir Putin gets desperate, that is when he is at his most dangerous. What extreme measures might he take to reverse his fortunes? It's not clear exactly how many of Russia's mounting problems are truly understood by the nation's leader. But if reports leaking out of Russia are accurate, Putin is paranoid, isolated, and acutely aware that he has good reason to be concerned about the future. Russia's standard playbook simply isn't working. However, if Putin's past conduct is any indication, he won't admit defeat. Instead, he will delve deep into the Kremlin playbook for a pair of highly unorthodox, high-risk options that could completely upend the current status quo. The first desperate gambit, a symbolic blow. It's time for foreign diplomats to evacuate Kyiv. Or at least, that's according to Sergei Lavrov, Russia's longtime foreign minister and a close ally of Vladimir Putin. Addressing the world in late May, Lavrov implored foreign nationals, ambassadors, and diplomatic staff to leave the Ukrainian capital as soon as possible. He then reportedly called his American counterpart, Marco Rubio, to relay essentially the same message. According to Lavrov, Ukrainian citizens should avoid the capital's administrative buildings, military sites, and other sensitive targets in advance of a crippling wave of Russian strikes against decision-making centers and command posts. Just days prior, Russia had carried out one of its largest attacks on Ukraine to date, which included the use of a dummy copy of Moscow's nuclear-capable Yars ballistic missile. But Lavrov's threat to the foreign diplomatic corps, especially diplomats hailing from Europe and North America, didn't inspire the level of fear he was counting on. Instead, European leaders made it clear they had no intention to recall their ambassadors, and even the United States remained non-compliant, despite then U.S. President Donald Trump's relative receptiveness to Russian grandstanding. As of the time of writing, Lavrov's big bad attack still hasn't materialized. However, close observers of the Ukraine war have indicated early signs that Russia could indeed be planning comprehensive strikes against Kyiv. Either way, Lavrov's threats and a recent flurry of similar warnings from Moscow have made it clear Russia is considering a substantial escalation in its long-range strike campaign. More specifically, Russia is considering strikes against all manner of Ukrainian symbolic and leadership targets, from the Ukrainian parliament and the Verkhovna Radar to President Volodymyr Zelensky himself. After more than 2 years of continuous full-scale warfare, it might seem rather unusual that Russia hasn't been pummeling Kyiv with such decapitation strikes. After all, Russia is trying to invade Ukraine by any means necessary and has proven entirely willing to try and destroy Ukrainian leadership. This includes the earliest days of the invasion, when Zelensky was targeted for assassination by multiple large units from the mercenary Wagner Group and the Chechen Kadyrovites. Ukraine's presidential and parliamentary buildings, its courts, and its ministry headquarters are all known fixed targets. And given some of the other wartime atrocities that Russian forces regularly perpetrate, it would be inconsistent for Moscow to decide that hitting high-profile targets in Kyiv would simply be a bridge too far. But aside from isolated incidents, Ukraine's biggest symbolic targets have mostly been avoided by Russian high command. This is partially because Russia seems not to be trying all that hard to hit them. We've explained this point in a recent episode, so we'll only cover it briefly here. But as strange as it may seem to those outside the Russian propaganda bubble, Russia frequently promotes the idea that it has exercised restraint throughout its invasion. The reasoning Russia provides to its own people tends to change daily. Sometimes it's because Russia would never wage the barbaric war that NATO would, other times, it's because Russia is only conducting a special military operation. Such strikes, however, would be more consistent with what Russia regards as a full-scale war. But as the war has dragged on and reports of Russian progress and imminent victory have become less credible, Moscow's supposed restraint has become a target of substantial internal criticism. According to these critics, Moscow's puny enemy has only been able to hold out this long because Russia refuses to do what's necessary, because Ukrainians haven't been properly reminded to fear Russian military might. They argue that if Russia were to demonstrate its willingness to engage in such strikes, Ukraine would supposedly just raise the white flag, making whatever concessions it could to avoid further destruction at Putin's hands. Thus, as Putin searches for ways to turn the tide back in Russia's favor, it's not difficult to see why symbolic strikes could be especially tempting. For one thing, they would allow Russia to stir up support on the home front and reclaim some of the nationalist fervor that Moscow relied upon during the war's earliest years. Perhaps strikes on symbolic or leadership targets would galvanize a new wave of Russian volunteers to join the war, or paralysis within Ukraine's chain of command would allow existing Russian units to press forward. Then there are the morale effects Putin might anticipate for Ukrainians on the front, who would be forced to watch their capital city burn, reminded that they are fighting an inevitable war against a great power. Finally, there's the possibility that the Vladimir bloggers and military hardliners are right, that if Ukraine were shown the full scope of Russia's capabilities, then Kyiv and its Western allies would realize it's well past time they back down. Unfortunately for Putin and his commanders, a hypothetical series of symbolic strikes on Ukraine suffers from the same core problem as every other desperate move on our list: it simply isn't likely to work. Historically, Russia, and especially Putin, seem to have had a reliably good idea of the kinds of threats that would make Europe back down from a challenge. But recently, that calculus has been breaking down. These overt displays of Russia's supposed military might have become much less credible than they used to be, and Europe seems to know it. Nor is it entirely accurate to say that Russia has been avoiding these targets. In Moscow's wave of strikes on May 24, impacts did damage the Ukrainian parliament building, and they caused significantly greater damage at the Kyiv Opera, the National Academy of Music, and the National Art Museum. Kyiv, Washington, and Brussels all saw those impacts, but none felt motivated to change their behavior when Lavrov threatened to go even further. So, yes, Russia can bomb an opera house. Compelling story. Just as important, these kinds of strikes would be unlikely to change the situation at the front, where Ukrainian drones will hold a clear advantage regardless of what's happening back in Kyiv. Worse yet, it's not clear that Russia has the capability to hit the targets it desires, even against fixed, open structures like the Vikova radar. Russian projectiles struggle to break through Ukrainian air defenses and only make significant progress when Russia can launch 1,000 projectiles or more nationwide at a given time. Russia can only carry out such strikes intermittently, given the level of preparation and resource expenditure they require. Meanwhile, Ukraine's actual leadership structure operates mostly out of fortified underground bunkers, hidden meeting spots, and decentralized command centers across the country. Zelensky and his inner circle have been so hard to kill, not because Russia hasn't been trying, but because they move around constantly, protect their communications, and only reveal their presence somewhere after they've already left. So Russia can try to hit key targets in Kyiv with a massive attack, but if Russia can't destroy any meaningful element of Ukraine's leadership, or worse, can't even hit the static targets in its crosshairs, then Ukraine emerges from that affair looking stronger, not weaker. And finally, there's one other difficult reality that might cause Putin and his allies to hold back. By attacking symbolic targets and leadership within Ukraine, Russia implicitly grants Ukraine permission to do the same in return. Ukrainian drones can strike targets deep into Russian territory, and Ukrainian intelligence can track and kill Russian commanders on a regular basis. So at this phase of the war, who's to say Ukraine isn't the one holding back? Unlike Russia, this is a more credible argument where Ukrainian leadership is concerned. After all, Ukraine was denied long-range strike weapons for years because its NATO allies were concerned that deep strikes into Russia could escalate the situation further. Dealing with that level of apprehension from its allies, Kyiv could probably deduce what might have happened if it, say, killed a Russian minister, launched a drone barrage at the Kremlin, or even took out Putin himself. But if Russia were to establish such a precedent first, then Ukraine might declare open season. This brings us to another dangerous possibility: lateral expansion. Beyond the prospect of a more focused Russian air campaign against Kyiv, there's the risk of a lateral expansion of the Russian conflict, specifically a strike against a vulnerable NATO nation, most likely Latvia. This is a possibility we discussed in detail with Ilya Sechin, a strategic advisor to Ukrainian High Command, in an interview published just a couple of weeks ago. At that time, the response in the comments was rather predictable, generally following the lines of, "Even if Russia had the army to do that, there's absolutely no way Putin would do something that stupid." Fast forward just a couple of weeks, though, and how quickly things change. Since that interview, several major outlets have confirmed that European intelligence is now very concerned about a Russian probing attack on a NATO member country, agreeing that Latvia is probably in the crosshairs. Just last Friday, on May 29, Swedish Defense Chief Michael Biden confirmed to Politico that a Russian threat to the Baltic states could happen any time. Russia, too, has been building its case against Latvia, publicly insinuating that Latvia has committed offenses that would justify a Russian response. As Russia's ambassador to the United Nations stated on May 19, the coordinates of decision-making centers in Latvia are well known, and membership in NATO will not protect you from retaliation. Specifically, Russia has alleged that Ukraine plans to launch military drones from Latvian soil and the soil of other Baltic states, although Latvia in particular seems to have drawn Moscow's eye. Nor are those the only indications that Russia could be planning something in Latvia or that Latvia would be a perfect candidate to attack. Over the last several weeks, Latvia's government has fallen apart and been replaced following a scandal in which Latvian air defenses failed to deal with two stray Ukrainian drones that veered off course and hit an empty oil storage site. Back in Moscow, meanwhile, the Russian State Duma approved a law that would allow Russia to use military force to protect Russians abroad, deploying soldiers in defense of those who face arrest, imprisonment, or trial overseas, including in international courts. Latvia's population is nearly one-quarter ethnic Russians, mostly living near the Russian and Belarusian borders, and up to 35% of Latvians speak Russian as a first or primary home language. Finally, although this incident didn't impact Latvia directly, Friday, May 29, was the latest incident in which Russian drones have flown into NATO member territory. This time, venturing into Romania, where a drone crashed into an apartment building in what appeared to be an interception attempt gone wrong. Now, it may still seem ludicrous that Russia would attempt an attack on a NATO member state, but that sort of escalatory brinkmanship is exactly how Putin has approached the NATO alliance for decades. And usually, he's been able to get NATO to back down. In this particular case, Putin's logic would be quite straightforward: by challenging the NATO alliance directly, Russia stands a chance of forcing the alliance to fracture and to renege on its collective defense obligations when the moment of truth arrives. Not all Western European nations, such as Spain, have demonstrated how unwilling they are to remilitarize. Capitals like London and Paris are struggling to keep up with more war-ready Eastern countries like Poland and Finland. And under a potential future Trump administration, it's entirely possible that America could simply decline to come to NATO's defense, citing European military spending failures, recent diplomatic disputes, or whatever else the White House might want. If Putin can fracture the alliance, he can fracture the very foundation Ukraine stands on: aid stops flowing, support dries up, and maybe, just maybe, Kyiv collapses under its own weight. And as for where Putin would find the excess troops to challenge the NATO alliance right now, quite frankly, it's a failure of understanding to claim that Putin would need to invade the entire Baltic region to achieve his intended result. Certainly, it's not likely that Putin could find the resources to overrun Latvia and Estonia, break through the Suwalki Gap in Lithuania, and bring 3 NATO members to heel simultaneously. But Putin doesn't need to do that. A NATO crisis only requires a limited probing offensive, which could be localized to areas with a friendly population, relatively weak local defenses, and minimal strategic value to the alliance. That's why Latvia is in the crosshairs, because it's home to an eastern corner largely populated by Russian speakers, where NATO defenses are underwhelming at best, and where Russia could cut in from its own territory, as well as from Belarus, with as few as a couple of thousand troops to park themselves on that territory and dare NATO to do something about it. For the alliance, especially in its current state, that's the worst-case scenario, that Russia would invade in a way that creates a make-or-break situation on Article 5, where the alliance is absolutely obligated to collectively defend itself, but the target isn't actually all that important and might even be Russia-friendly. In that situation, it's all too easy for, say, French or Italian leaders to insist that their troops won't die over a tiny bit of Latvian soil, or for a future Donald Trump to believe Putin's claim that Russia is defending Russian speakers on foreign soil. There are, however, two very important problems with this approach if Russia were to try it. Problem number one is that this sort of attack might have actually worked on NATO, say, 2 years ago or even a single year ago. But more likely than not, the alliance has come just far enough that it could deal with a situation like this. European leaders have been preparing for a coalition deployment into Ukraine outside of the NATO alliance and without US leadership for a while now. The continent is drawing up plans to manage its own defense instead of relying on Washington, should that ultimately be required. Countries on or near NATO's eastern front, especially Finland, Poland, and Germany, are demonstrating that they will respond to Russian aggression regardless of an alliance decision on the subject. And the alliance itself is learning to become more flexible in ways that would allow those countries to take the lead on rapid response without turning this into the referendum on NATO that Putin desires. And problem number two, Europe knows that an attack on Latvia might be coming, meaning that the element of surprise has evaporated. On May 28, the governments of Germany and the Netherlands announced that they are about to take joint command of NATO land forces in Estonia and Latvia within just the next couple of months. Not only does that mean that Berlin and The Hague will be in charge of split-second tactical decisions to defend the Baltics instead of relying on Washington, but it also means NATO commanders will be much closer to the front, allowing them to draw in what one NATO official described to Reuters as mass at speed. Even more important was the announcement 2 days earlier that NATO will now assign an entire corps to Estonia and Latvia in addition to the new tactical command. In wartime, an army corps would comprise several divisions of troops, potentially as many as 40,000 to 60,000 personnel. And even though a peacetime deployment would be quite a bit smaller, the corps is still expected to bring new air defense, artillery, and other key capabilities that will double NATO's existing defenses there. Again, these changes are expected on a timeline of just a couple of months, meaning that by the time Russia can divert and build up enough of a troop presence to slice off a bit of Latvian territory, it may already be too late to get away with such an act. We should mention, of course, that Russia does have other tools for lateral expansion. NATO sources have indicated that Russia could try to take a bit of territory in the high Arctic from either Finland or Norway, or try to occupy a vulnerable island like Gotland or Svalbard. Or, as we explained in a separate episode last week, Russia could try to attack a more isolated non-NATO country and make an example of it, rallying support on the home front and trying to inspire fear in Ukraine and its allies. In that episode, we put the spotlight on Georgia, where a Russia-friendly government could essentially roll over for an easy conquest or intervention, as well as Armenia, a tiny country that could be overwhelmed by even a relatively small Russian offensive. But both European intelligence and the direction of Russia's public statements indicate that Latvia is the country in Russia's sights. And now, Russia's window appears to be closing fast. With luck, the world won't have to worry about either of these desperate Russian attempts to change the status quo. Perhaps for once, Putin and his close advisors will see reason or develop an understanding of their strategic situation that more closely matches the world around them. If Russia does decide to try and escalate the conflict, then both of the options we've discussed today will probably lead to ruin. But if Vladimir Putin truly understands what's happening in Ukraine today, then he understands that this war is leading to ruin anyway. If one last desperate gambit were to fail, the ultimate outcome of this war would remain unchanged. It's just that a lot more blood would have been spilled to get there.